I'll try to be brief, inshallah, but salam alaikum. As Sadia said, my name is Ramla, and I'm a writer in Minneapolis. And I wanted to talk to you guys about media as a tool of empowerment today. This topic is particularly relevant because as Somalis, we've been under intense scrutiny the past few months. I think we've been on Anderson Cooper's A3AC 360 every day 2 weeks ago, and we were on the cover of the New York Times, we were in USA Today, Washington Post, and various other major news institutions. So I want to talk a little bit about media, and before I go into it, I just want to introduce the idea of media. Media refers to tools used to disseminate information or data. So this includes entertainment, movies, music, things you see on TV, as well as hard news, what we typically assume media to be. And this is, radio, internet, print journalism, or broadcast. To contribute to media or engage with it, you don't need a press pass. You don't need to be a journalist to interact with media. But it's important to contribute to it because we need to correct perception sometimes because journalists aren't always necessarily well-versed in various communities. It's also important to shed light on topics that are important to our community and introduce them to public spotlight. And now, being media savvy is a critical component to empowerment. We all know that knowledge is power. And those who are producing knowledge or producing news have the ability to frame issues, shape public opinion, and then consequently, influence public discourse. And public opinion actually has tremendous ability to shape laws and to influence legislators. I want to just mention a couple polls that I think are very important, and both of these were conducted right after the infamous cartoons controversy in 2007. I don't know if you remember them, but it happened in Denmark, and it became international news, and several riots occurred consequently. But one poll was taken by ABC News and the Washington Post, and people said that 46% of Americans held negative views toward Islam and Muslims, and the same number also thought that Muslims as a population were more prone to violence than other people. And that says a lot about how people view Muslims and also what they know about Muslims. Another poll was conducted by CARE, and that poll said that 50% of people had negative views toward Islam, and that 1/4 held extreme anti-Muslim bias. So when you consider newspaper circulation or hits on a particular site, this literally translates into tremendous power because people who are producing stories and framing the piece of news that we consume are essentially controlling the images that we see and the tone that we take in. And for those on the receiving end, reading more and interacting with different modes of media is empowering because it exposes us to different perspectives. Having said that, as Somalis and as Muslims and as people of color, it's important for us to be critical consumers of news and not take everything we see, on CNN or in the New York Times as gospel because it's humans who are producing this and it's prone to error. And news outlets, everything from Fox News, which people consider very biased, to even the National Geographic, all have elements of bias. And ultimately, editors and corporate executives determine what's published, aired, posted, or printed. And writers and editors usually know the political viewpoints, the socioeconomic condition, religious belief, and even prejudices of their audience. And they often try to cater to this audience. So when you take that into consideration, it's important to take a piece of news in that context. And you don't have to dig too deep to know this. Looking at even how we name conflicts, what makes one conflict a genocide and another a civil war? It's how the media basically frames it and how it chooses to label it that people eventually take. What makes, for example, Sudan different from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Iraq? A lot of it has to do with war on terror rhetoric. On a micro level, and looking at our own community, we'll find that images of Somalia are often, literally the iconic image of Somalia is the overcrowded Toyota technical truck with, men in their AK-47s. And that influences how we understand and how we know our own country, and we internalize the media that we consume. So even though like 2/3 of the country is safe, we think that Somalia is drowning in violence essentially, and that there's chaos everywhere. So this is, with the ongoing conflict in the South, but also with the issue of piracy. So it becomes important for us to know ourselves and to know our own reality, and to, look at different modes of media to try to filter bias from truth. But it's particularly also important for us because, we're here in the States, we're Muslim in post 9/11 America, Black in a country with, severe history of racism, and immigrants during an era where, people are building walls everywhere and anti-immigrant sentiment is very, very rampant. And stories and footage and images of Somalis often reflect that triple bias. But at the same time, Somalis aren't exclusive in this, and the way media portrays ethnic and visible minorities is often has signs of bias, and marginalized populations are often reduced to a set of knowable traits that are fundamentally based on inferiority, based on highlighting difference, and as well as a tendency to homogenize communities. So all Blacks, do this, or all women do this, and it typically only happens with marginalized or vulnerable populations. If we look at Muslims, for example, prominent images of Muslims are usually of Muslims praying in masses, or there'll be an ambiguous woman turned around wearing hijab or a niqab, or a man with a beard on a minaret, or violent images of people doing awful things. So those aren't images that people can relate to, and it's often images that people find repulsive. So when that's all people see of Muslims, and they don't see Muslims doing, normal things, eating, smiling, engaging, then they tend to have a view of Islam and of Muslims that reinforces the images that they see and the message that's being sent out. And many times these stereotypes and oftentimes incorrect information about communities exist because of unchecked power and because of racial parity or lack of racial parity in newsrooms. And I think it's up to us to hold journalists accountable, and to also become journalists. When we look at newsrooms in the country, the American Society of News Editors does a census every year, and the latest one said that people of color make up about 11% of all journalists, which is interesting because people of color make up 28% of the US population. So this number is grossly disproportional. And in the past decade, there's been a net increase of Latino, Asian, and Native American journalists, and a net decline of Black and Muslim journalists. So that also says a lot about why, we're not represented, or why we see images that don't reflect our culture and our existence in this country. There's also an issue with retainment. Journalists of color are far more likely than white journalists to say that they might leave the industry, and 3/4 of all journalists of color agreed that they sometimes feel like they have to work harder than white journalists to get ahead. So representation is key in covering communities, and newsrooms need to reflect the changing demographics of our country. So we ultimately need to send more kids to J schools and produce more journalists. Having said that, a lot of people say that the industry is crumbling. Is there hope for media, and is there hope for emerging journalists of color? And I think obviously the answer is yes. We're Muslims, so I think having hope is fundamental to our faith. But also, there's tremendous ability and tremendous potential for journalists and writers to have their voices heard, especially considering the political climate that we are in today, and especially considering the need for constructive and intelligent dissent, debate, and engagement. We essentially need to create our own media, and we need to empower ourselves. And really, power just means the ability to act. So if you can get up and meet with an editorial board that you feel like doesn't reflect your views, or if you write a letter to the editor or contact the reader's representative of your local paper to establish a relationship with them and to also teach them a little bit about your identity and your faith, then I think that definitely goes a long way. It's very important to hold media accountable. It's often the case that those being stereotyped have little to say about how they're represented. This doesn't mean that we should always expect positive stories, because no community is inherently good or inherently free from error. But at the same time, we do need to hold press accountable, especially if the Society of Professional Journalists has a code of ethics that all journalists are supposed to follow. And some of these principles include encouraging proportional reporting. So for example, if there's an issue in a given community and it's very small on scale, if journalists are portraying it to be an incredibly large issue and it's not the case, then you can hold your media outlet accountable to that. They're required to give voice to the voiceless and make sure that different perspectives are included in their stories, including official and unofficial sources. They're supposed to minimize harm to marginalized groups and show compassion for those who might be adversely affected by their news coverage. And this does include, like for example, right after 9/11, when the political and social climate was particularly harsh on Muslims, journalists then had a responsibility to minimize harm. And I think what's going on in Minneapolis now with the case of the missing Somali men and the indictments and stuff, reporters now have a responsibility to minimize harm in that regard as well. It's also important for journalists to not be ethnocentric. They need to examine their personal culture and values and avoid imposing those beliefs on other people. And then finally, and this is a pretty important one, is to avoid stereotyping. So having said that, there are many, many opportunities to engage more intimately with media. You can suggest stories or angles to journalists because they're often just looking for a fresh perspective. It's also important to contribute to news, writing commentary letters to the editor, blogging, or whatever your writing comfort is. But essentially, the sky is the limit, and each individual has power to represent themselves and their community through media. And any effort to achieve representation or any attempt, I think, to engage with mainstream media will have to come from us as people of color, as minorities, as Muslims, as Somalis, because no one will advocate for you and no one will create media that reflects your community. It's our job to do that. And that's all I have to say. If you have questions, I can take them. Otherwise, I yield my time.